I would like to welcome you all to tonight's panel titled Asian Migration in a Global Context. Our panelists are bringing together these conversations and how these categories are governed and contested within Asia.
In Asia, keeping migration temporary, you're welcome to labor but not to stay, that kind of idea, is the prevalent regime.
The federal government calls non-immigrant temporary visa, and it's reserved for folks with at least a bachelor's degree and who would be employed in a specialty occupation.
It's personalized in terms of how I think about my own status as an uninvited migrant on these lands.
They also encourage temporariness in the eventual return of their citizen sojourners abroad in order to be able to secure remittance flows, homeward investments, and transnational links.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ms. Babati. I'm the research analyst at the Center for International and Regional Studies, and on behalf of the Center, I would like to welcome you all to tonight's panel titled Asian Migration in a Global Context. I will be getting to the panel very shortly, but before I do, I would like to remind everyone of a few housekeeping points. I request all the guests to either turn off their phones or put them on silent so that you do not disturb the conversation. We will continue to expect more people, so if you could just scoot over or make space as people come in, that would be very kind of you. We are recording tonight's talk, so if you're interested in revisiting the conversation or sending it to your colleagues, friends, and networks, please visit our website or YouTube channel. It's cirs.georgetown.edu, and from there you can find different links and explore more about the conversation. If you haven't already, please sign up to our mailing list if you're interested in attending and knowing more about our events, our research. Please talk to one of my colleagues, give us your card or your mailing details, and we'll be happy to put you on our mailing list. There will be an allocated time for audience Q&A, so if you have a question, please remember it, and there will be someone to hand you the mic after the moderated discussion to ask your questions. And after the event is done at 7, we will have a reception, so please join us for that. So tonight's talk is part of a larger project that we are working on at CIRS that looks at migration studies from the global south, and it is a multi-year project that has different clusters that we're exploring, and one of them is categories, and how do we problematize categories that are developed, or the frameworks around the categories that are developed from the global north, and how do we explore them from the perspective of the global south. Some of the scholars tonight in the room and the scholars on the stage are part of that conversation, and we've been having really intense, in-depth conversation around these topics for the past 2 days. So for tonight's conversation, our panelists are bringing together these conversations and how these categories are governed and contested within Asia, and how these transnational flows go from, to, and within the global south. Moving beyond fixed labels such as migrants, refugees, skilled workers, non-skilled workers, victimhood, the list goes on. The discussion will explore how such categories are developed within state regimes, what policies are there, and how do they shape mobility in the Asian context. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists for tonight. So in the order they're sitting, we have Brenda Yeoh. She is a distinguished professor at the National University of Singapore and the Migration and Mobilities Cluster at NAS Research Institute. NAS stands for National University of Singapore. Her research interests in Asian migration spans themes including social reproduction and care migration, skills migration, and marriage and migrants and cultural policies. Following Brenda, we have Payal Banerjee. Payal is a professor of sociology at Smith College. Her research focuses on political economies of migration, globalization, the role of policies in structuring labor incorporation, migrant categories, and status displacement. Last but not the least, we have Bina Fernandez, who is a professor in development studies at University of Melbourne. Her research looks at migration and social policies, analyzed through the feminist lens of social reproduction. Our moderator for tonight is one of our very own, Professor Walid Ziad. Walid is an assistant professor of history here at Georgetown University. Associate. Thank you. Continuing, Walid Ziad is an associate professor of history at the university here at Georgetown University in Qatar. His research interests lie at the intersection of social history, religious studies, and anthropology. His scholarship examines the historical and philosophical foundation of Muslim revivalism and mysticism in South and Central Asia, as well as Iran. With that, I hand it over to you, Walid. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction. A little bit disappointed that my demotion was announced in public, but so be it. And of course, thanks to CIRS for organizing not just this event, but really a whole exciting series of events over the course of 2 years is the time frame of this broader theme. So we'll begin with opening remarks from each of our distinguished panelists, and in the interest of time, it's the difficult bit, we ask that comments be kept to about 5-6 minutes. Does that seem appropriate? Okay, great. Lovely. So we'll begin with Professor Yeoh.
So it's going to be terribly difficult trying to talk about Asian migration in 5-6 minutes. So I have some slides to help me keep to time. So I would like to, and Misbah gave us a whole series of topics, and I thought it would be good to start with the migration regime in Asia, the temporary migration regime. So in Asia, keeping migration temporary, I mean, yeah, welcome to labor, but not to stay, that kind of idea, is the prevalent regime. So apart from a very narrow, privileged pathway for highly skilled migrants to gain residency and sometimes citizenship, most Asian receiving nation states, from Singapore to Taiwan to Hong Kong and so forth, they tend to, for the lower skilled migrants, settlement is ruled out. Family reunification and long-term integration is not part of the deal. And so the idea that you can acquire sort of a pathway to citizenship is a no-go for the lower skill. So, and this is something that is of interest to receiving nation states, but also the sending nation states like the Philippines and Indonesia that sent out sort of large numbers of migrant men and women. They also encourage temporariness and the eventual return of their citizen sojourners abroad in order to be able to secure remittance flows, homeward investments, and transnational links. So if you look at the migration literature, whilst the migration pathways to permanency are narrowing worldwide, sort across the globe, basically, I would say that temporary migration has been the mainstay of transnational labor circulation in Asia from the start. So why do I want to start with this particular sort of idea of temporary migration regime? Because I think it'd be important to bear in mind that we need to give attention to the broader regime in order to be able to build theories of our own. So in migration studies, is of course highly dominated by Western-centric paradigms that are largely based on the idea of migration and settlement, assimilation, acculturation, and integration. And to cut the long story short, in thinking about theorizing from Asia, I want to, in a sense, move to a different way of looking at migrant-local interactions in terms of the temporal, spatial politics of migrant encounter. So in the last couple of minutes I just want to quickly introduce two sort of conceptual tools that I've been working with: enclavization and enclosure. And so you see in this picture, enclavization at work in Singapore. This is Little India, and this is spatial temporal process where transient migrant populations can stake temporary claims on public spaces. So unlike the migrant concentrations of the West, which are residential in nature, these kinds of enclavization of public spaces are temporary. It's based, of course, on migrants' strategic choice, but also highly constrained by host society's exclusionary politics. So in Singapore, we tend to call them weekend enclaves because they rise during the weekend and melt away during the work week, and or more pejoratively, migrant hotspots. These are ephemeral, and as Munyandi calls it, they tend to form and unform through a variety of different practices, tensions, and dynamics. And the second sort of conceptual tool that I want to work with is this idea of enclaves, basically in Singapore, basically means that the migrants gather for networking and sociality. But this then came to a head, to cut a long story short, in 2013 because of the Little India riots. So there was a set of riots in Little India, and so these spaces then became seen to be dangerous and in need of more surveillance and policing. So apart from increased surveillance, there's also the idea that why not, in a sense, contain them somewhere else and far away from their own enclaves, and that, in a sense, led to the idea of enclosure, which is the construction of borders, whether symbolic or material, in order to mark the separation between migrant others and the citizens of the country. And the best example is the Tuas View dormitory, which is a mega dormitory with 16,800 beds at the very periphery of the Singapore island. And this hosting all the migrant workers in this particular dormitory provides a psychological buffer between inside and outside, and therefore reinforcing understandings of difference. So, and I just want to also add that these spaces are not just spaces of discipline and surveillance in order to constrain mobility, but also care, and is very much part of the whole enclosure idea, providing pastoral care, whether it's exercises or skills training or sort of cricket field in order for the South Asian migrants to have recreation, in order to keep them away from the enclaves that I talked about, which are largely in the center of the city. So these are strategies to try to fashion compliance out of unruly migrant subjects. So and of course, during COVID, Singapore became well known for two separate infections. 90% of the cases were amongst the dormitory migrant workers, and only 10% of the cases were among the general population. So I could speak more about that, but my last sort of slide, and this picture shows it's also highly gendered. So these are largely Filipino domestic workers colonizing sort of curbed spaces near Orchard Road. So basically, I think the point I want to make is that temporary migration raises the conundrum for receiving states, not so much about integration, but how not to integrate migrants into whole society. And that opens up a different way of looking at migrant local encounters. So, and my suggestion is that this means that we need to, I'm a geographer, so we need to attend to a wider variety of social landscapes that feature migrants, not just where they live, not just residential concentrations, but also these kinds of social landscapes and commercial activity. And the second thing that I wanted to end with is to say that we also then need to look at migrant claims making, not just through the lens of legality, but also to look at how it's, in a sense, enacted on the ground through struggles over space and over the labor process. So I think that's basically what I wanted to talk about. If you're interested, that's one of the publications that contains some of these ideas in urban studies. Yeah, thank you for listening.
Dr. Yeoh, thank you very much, and especially for compressing a volume in a very small amount of time. Dr. Banerjee.
Thank you. First of all, Ms. Bhatt, thanks for the wonderful introduction. Much appreciated. And thanks for moderating. Really meaningful. And, as I speak about what may seem on the surface a very specific case, you'll see that there are some resonances with what Professor Brenda Yeoh just talked about. So the place that I'd like to take you from Singapore now to North America, the United States in particular, where for the last several years I've been studying Indian migrant workers in the IT sector employed specifically on the H-1B visa, which I think many of you have heard about. It's the H-1B in the larger umbrella of U.S. immigration policy is part of what the federal government calls non-immigrant temporary visa. And it's reserved for folks with at least a bachelor's degree and who would be employed in a specialty occupation, which includes the tech sector. Promise me you won't laugh. Specialty occupation includes fashion models. So anyhow, that's definitely not the people I'm talking about. So since the 1990s, the vast majority of workers from overseas that have been hired in the tech sector in IT. And within this group, the largest recipient, one single country recipient, has been India. And this visa is given for 3 years, then it can be renewed for another 3 if the employer agrees, and it can be extended that point forward if the employee stays with the same employer. There are restrictions about changing your company, and there's a lot of paperwork if you want to. So what that means then is the migrant worker on the H-1B visa becomes hyper-dependent for 2 things on the employer. One, for their job, livelihood, and then relatedly to having the permit to physically exist in the United States. As you can imagine, this gives the employer a substantial amount of power over their migrant visa holding immigrant employee. And relatedly then, if you look at the outcome that people talk about during the interviews, is it creates precarity, both labor and status precarities, wage differentials, a lot of relocation from one client site to another. It creates wage specific. I can talk about that later. I won't get into the details of why folks on the H-1B visa often end up making less money compared to their U.S. citizen or green card holding counterparts. So this is the overall domain of difference, specifically race-based, migrant status-based difference that we're looking at. And the key word I would like us to focus here is status-dependent, and the multiple ways in which the H-1B visa heightens a particular kind of dependence. Now, if we use that word and transnationalize our lens a little bit and look at it from not so much the fact that this is a US-specific single visa matter, I would encourage us to think about how this also reveals a larger, on a transnational level, global north-south dependence, because if you look at the tech sector in India, all the software export, the tremendous amount of global north capital that was invested in Bangalore and elsewhere, you see that the Indian export market and the Indian tech sector is highly dependent on its markets elsewhere, Western Europe, North America, so on and so forth. So there is a financial investment-linked dependence as well in terms of what India would export, the valuation of it that determines India's GDP, exchange rate, and also more recently we have seen the various kind of leverage that our overseas business partners have in terms of imposing higher tariffs. So this is a much larger economic, financial, corporate relationship that also has a specific racial and historical post-colonial context. So this then also raises another point, which is if you look at how this massive number of IT and IT labor force and STEM workers, where did they come from in India all of a sudden? And you see that this didn't happen overnight. This was policy adopted by the Indian government in the 50s and 60s and so on and so forth. And from the 80s and 90s onward, you see that the ways in which India was able to increase its supply of STEM workers was also tied to the investments that I just talked about. So as money poured in from IBM, Oracle, Microsoft, and dozens of other companies into India, that also shaped in profound ways the preparation of a labor force that would then be tapped either in India or as migrants who would then go to work on the H-1B visa in the United States. So we see a historically specific relationship of capital-linked dependence that has one articulation in form of the visa itself, which takes us to the specific history of Asian migration in the United States. But if you look at it from the Asian Global South point of view, that story is not separate or it's not separate from the larger story of how Global South economies are reliant on exports and investments from and with the Global North. So I shall end there and look forward to your questions. Thanks for listening.
Dr. Banerjee, thank you very much. I particularly appreciate the framing of moving from the individual and dependence into the geopolitical and the whole story of colonialism and post-colonialism being one to reinforce this dependence. And now, last but not least, Professor Fernandez.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. And I'm going to move this conversation into a slightly different register. So bear with me, because I'm going to speak from the vantage point of living in the island off the coast of Asia, that very large island that is now known as Australia, but has a long history of, and by the way, that phrase, island off the coast of Asia, is not my phrase. It's Bina Fernandez's phrase, I must acknowledge. So situated there, I think we don't often think of Australia as part of Asia, but I want to position Australia as part of Asia, as part of Asia Pacific more broadly. And depending on how we go on time, there are two sets of comments I want to make. The first is a set of 3 points related to Australia and Australia's positioning in terms of thinking about migration and what it has to offer, so to speak. And the other, if there's time, then maybe add a few more sort of typologies of thinking about migration regimes in the larger Asian context. Okay, so first to the three things I want to say about Australia. And I would like to begin with the First Nations peoples of Australia, the Indigenous Aboriginal people, and the fact that I and most other Australians are uninvited migrants, settlers, who, it is a settler colonial context. And so we need to, for me, as a scholar of migration, it's personalized in terms of how I think about my own status as an uninvited migrant on these lands. And learning from First Nations peoples is part of my process of coming to terms with being a settler. And one of the things I've learned in the past decade and a half that I've lived there is the generosity with which First Nations peoples welcome people onto their country. Yeah, there's a ceremonial process called Welcome to Country, where people who come in they go through a ceremony of smoking where you're purified, but also you accept the laws of country. And what are the two laws of country? Caring for people and caring for country. Caring for country being more broadly the different layers of country, not just the land, but also the other living beings on country. Yeah, so that's one thing I'd like to put there as lessons about how to treat strangers that come to your country that we could all be learning from. So that's the first thing. The other lessons that we haven't learned, and this is in terms of thinking about Australia as a state, a settler colonial state, is more lessons on what not to do, right? And that's our quote unquote Australian model of offshoring detention. I'm sure you know the whole infamous treatment of people who come as asylum seekers on boat. This is since the early 2000s. Australia's been pioneering, quote unquote, this whole strategy of putting people into offshore detention centers on little islands around, whether it was Christmas Island earlier, and now Manus Island, and Nauru. Now, that model is now being replicated by many of the other sort of first world countries. Yeah, you see that in Europe, and you see that in the US as well. Not necessarily something to learn from, but it is something that is getting proliferated. The third sort of Australian specific example that I'd like to speak to is more positive, in that Australia has the first bilateral climate mobility agreement globally. And this is with the Pacific island of Tuvalu, which is in one of the islands that are in danger of getting submerged, global warming and rising sea levels. And there's a whole agreement that has just come into place where over a period of years, you'll have people from Tuvalu coming as full permanent migrants to Australia. I think I do have a few more minutes, so I'm going to just shift gears a little bit and speak to a couple of other migration regimes that I think are important to keep in mind when we're talking about migration in the Asian context. I mean, Brenda and Payal have talked about temporary migrants, but there's also other, given the large size of the population in Asia, we have significant other forms of migration regimes. One that we could be talking about is the sort of forced deportation regime that's been happening, particularly with people from Afghanistan being deported from places like Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, and here we're talking, over 1 million people in the last year being, where in a context where in many of these nations there was actually very good treatment of people from Afghanistan as guests in different ways, but that global shift in terms of hostility that we're seeing in global North context is also making itself apparent here. We've also seen in the context of Cambodia and Thailand that again forced deportations of Cambodians from Thailand. So deportation regimes is one type of regime that we should also be thinking about in the Asian context. Second, we should also be thinking about displacement. Asia is a region that's susceptible to a lot of floods and other kinds of natural hazards that displaces up to 24 million people. And a lot of these are internally displaced, and a lot of them have faced multiple displacements. And again, in a context where cross-border migrations is not very well sort of tolerated, this is something we need to be perhaps keeping in mind when we're talking about migration in the Asian context. And what was my third point? I think I might just. Oh, yes, of course, the statelessness. Yeah. So we have a statelessness regime with over 1 million people from the Rohingya people in Bangladesh, but also dispersed over other countries in Southeast Asia, and this is the largest population of stateless people in the world. Yeah, and that's a huge sort of again Asia-specific regime that we need to be thinking and talking about. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Professor Fernandez, thank you very much. And to all our panelists, thank you very much for your opening remarks. We are talking about obviously very different geographies, very different histories of each of the recipient nations and each of the populations that are visiting. I don't know if visiting is the right word to use here. My apologies. But at the same time, there are certain cross-cutting themes, and myself, even as an outsider to this field, I see this idea of precarity, the idea of anxiety, both from obviously those who are, in fact, from both sides, including from the recipient nation and the anxiety towards new populations. And then, of course, the issue of power balances. And it seems that all of you are referring to some sort of enforced long-term power balances. So I'll start us off with a few questions. And the first question that I'm going to ask is actually coming from my own bias as a historian, with an interest in change and issues of convergence and divergence. So I'm curious that do you see at a global level larger trends in the way in which migrant categorization, the taxonomies that you referred to, the concepts of documentedness, and of course, corollary, legality, illegality, are developing? And I ask this particularly because the receiving states that you focus on all seemingly operate within a neoliberal development paradigm, within a global economy, which raises the question of whether this produces convergence in migrant governance. And I'm just going to add another, in fact, question to this question of, are we actually seeing trends, global trends, because of sort of similar trajectories of each of these recipient nations? But this is perhaps a naive question, but I'm curious that in the way that you see the governance and management changing or evolving in each of these contexts, are there certain states that are actually seen as leaders or which actually provide the models in all of this? I mean, you were, Professor Fernandez, you were talking about the global shift towards hostility, which of course raises the question that are there certain states that are perhaps exemplifying hostility, which is then replicated by other states?
I guess I do think it's context specific. I think it is difficult to generalize, but yes, you do have, to a certain extent, models that people try to reshape to their own specificities of how they want to manage whatever is constructed as a problem. Yeah. So.
It's, of course, very difficult to look at the present through and predict what kinds of trends there are. But I think most of us would say that it's not hunky-dory and that the trends are more towards managing migration and has become sort of the norm that migration is a problem that has to be managed properly. IOM's safe and orderly migration is one kind of model to follow. And I think in the conference that we had over the last 2 days, we were talking about the increase in what I would have called categorize and control kind of systems, which is to do with dividing populations up into groups so that you can then selectively admit some and not others. That's a very general strategy. So it's not creating a blank wall and not allowing migration, because migrants also needed for like aging countries and with with a need to grow their labor supply. So managed migration is very much about dividing populations in order to create this sense of openness, but also to allow for selection of who you want to, in a sense, admit and who you do not want to admit. So I think that is one of the trends that I see. And the second thing that I wanted to say, which is to do with the fact that there's also policy mobility in the region and across the world. So countries that have had migration for a longer while are sometimes seen to be the so-called leaders that have built a particular model, and these models get exported. So, for example, in the Asian region, I mean, Singapore is one of the countries that have a scheme for migrant domestic workers for a long time, since the 1970s, whereas countries like Japan and Korea, with aging populations, do not have that, but they're hitting a major crisis, a care crisis, and so they've been sending many delegations to Singapore in order to learn from the system of how to, in a sense, use the scheme of migrant domestic workers for their own populations. Of course, there are many issues involved because the whole context and the whole the cultures are completely different. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the questions you raised is, are some countries offering the dubious leadership? And I would say yes, for sure. The US being one of them. In the US, there are 80 kinds of non-immigrant visa classes. And if you look at the H-1B in particular, you'll see that series of reforms, a few in the 80s, then in the 90s, there was first the creation of the H class. Then that was fragmented further as they made several within the H class. Then you have spouses of the H-1B visa holders, which would be H4. What I want to highlight here is, one, there's a proliferation of the different individual visa classes. So that's one. That's the that raises the visibility of the number of visas. But if you look at within one visa and see what is possible, you'll see that the state often, when it's feeling generous, expand what a person on that visa can do, and when it's the opposite, shrink it. So the spouses of H-1B holders, which in the real world are mostly women, wives of the migrant employee, there was a time when they could not work in the labor market. Then that was removed. So people were very happy that all the highly qualified wives can now go and compete and get a job. And then that was revoked. So it comes and goes. And then you can, it's not just that, can I work now? Can I work next year? It's the heightening of anxiety and unpredictability and the shifts then you see in the power dynamics in a heterosexual marriage. So there's all these social considerations to take into account. And these models are replicated elsewhere. Thanks.
Thank you very much. This is
Ziad, if I could just add
Please.
one more sort of example that is about categorize and control, but it's not necessarily about management of labor strategies. When we're talking about the Indian context, and we see the ways in which the current government, the BJP-led government, has implemented all kinds of measures to categorize and control its own population and who it perceives as outsiders. The motivation there is not about managing labor as much as it's animated by Hindu fundamentalist ideas of exclusion of Muslim or the understanding of supposed Muslim outsiders. That whole construction. So it's yes, you do have these kinds of categorized and controls, but the purposes might be quite varied in how countries construct those programs.
Thank you very much for that. This is actually not a question that I was planning on asking, but it came to my mind as I was listening. That I'm assuming that in the last couple of years, with smart cities, AI, and of course, further sophistication of surveillance technologies and data processing, and of course, the technology transfer that are happening in this respect, that there are significant changes or significant ways in which the processes that each of you are studying have changed?
What has changed and what hasn't? Okay, so my sense is that with digitalization, I mean, and new technologies, advanced sort of technological means, is a double-edged sword. So on one hand, surveillance mechanisms have intensified and used in border controls, for example. In the past, I mean, in the Asian context, before biometrics, you could, if you're not in a sense trying to come into the country when you're not supposed to, you could change your name, right, and sort of get fake papers and therefore find a way of readmission into the country. But with biometrics, that's no longer possible. So some of the people that I interviewed said that they were caught at the border because biometrics means that they can identify the person behind the names and behind the documents. So on the other hand, I mean, particularly communications technologies, I think is also a tool that migrants can also use to their advantage in terms of creating social networks and virtual communications at a sort of speed and with a flexibility that you can't before. So in that sense, it depends on the situation, I would say, and but we should not think about digital technologies as either positive or negative because they have to be embedded in the context. Yeah.
I'll add this, that one would imagine that with improvements in technology and AI and the various other sorts of innovations that the state has in its capacity to use, that things would actually speed up in terms of how quickly applications are processed, how quickly things move step by step in the visa application process or the green card application process. But you see the reverse or the opposite actually, because while improvements in technology would allow faster processing, policy decisions actually put pauses in between and delay movement from one sort of approval to the next step. So migrants now are really dealing with a range of uncertainties. In fact, when I was boarding the flight in Boston, I was seated next to an industrial engineer who said that I'm trying to change employers, and my ears immediately H-1B employers. I said, tell me what's going on. And she said that my visa is supposed to transfer. It used to be a straightforward process, fairly, relatively. But now, no updates. It's just stuck in wherever it was for months. And I don't know what's happening. So, yes, that's a short scenario example.
So technology improves while bureaucrats and politicians don't necessarily. No, thank you for sharing that. Would you like to comment on that, or I can move on to, next question? A lot of the discussions of the last 2 days have been about moving beyond fixed labels, but the categories can also serve functions, and then, of course, can serve functions towards protection, towards rights claims, towards visibility. How can we critique the labeling system and the sort of multiple categories that, as you mentioned, are developing quite rapidly without inadvertently making migrants more vulnerable?
I do think that's a challenging question, actually, because when we have categories, there's always a process of demarcating a boundary, and there's somebody or somebodies who are excluded with that process of classification. And the question then always is who and what is the power differential along that process of exclusion. I mean, that's how I think of it. So, and this was one of the conversations I was having with colleagues. Is is there a way we can think about maybe flexible categorizations, the ones that are not so rigid, that there's room for interpretations, and that you take the more generous interpretations when you can. So, I mean, that was one of the ideas that was sparked through the conversations we had in these past couple of days. Because I honestly actually think that the quest to propose an alternative category that wouldn't get ossified is a dead end. I don't think that's a possibility, really. So, I mean, maybe I'm just being too pessimistic, but maybe my colleagues will have some other ideas.
Okay, so more pessimism from historical times, and you're a historian, so I feel doubly indulged here. If you look at colonial policies and racial management, Africa, Asia, you see that there's a proliferation of racial, ethnic, caste categories, which tell people this is who you are. You're not that person. You belong here. If you can't move, if you do move, it will be because we made you move, and so on and so forth. So it actually encourages a certain kind of identity position, oppositional and in relation to others who have been demarcated by those kinds of classifications. I see a similar relationship when I look at how visas produce these sorts of identification and self-identity. So an Indian tech worker on the H-1B visa might say, I am highly skilled, I am in a specialty occupation, I have nothing in common to H-2 visa holder who's a seasonal migrant agricultural worker. So there's no scope of seeing that, we actually represent a formation in global political economy where our relationship to global capital, if they're not same, but they're comparable structurally and so on and so forth. And students, for instance, think of I am an international student. My rights and entitlements are really limited. So these visa categories actually, and I'm not saying that people don't have agency, they don't challenge it, critique it, do all sorts of things to subvert it every day, all the time. That said, it also encourages this tension where I'm a student or I'm a techie on H-1B visa. Can I do this? Can I do that? I'm better than somebody not so. Yeah, you get the point, right?
So I guess it's up to me to be a bit more optimistic. So I'll try. Of course, I totally agree with the other panelists that basically categorization and classification is an art of governance, right? So it is the Foucauldian idea that by categorizing, you are able to then, in a sense, control and shape subjectivity. So that I think is very much part of migration management, migration governance, and in moving from colonial times to now. I mean, we see sort of racial categories, which are very powerful, not so much replaced, but in a sense masked now by other kinds of categorization, including the skills hierarchy that we spoke about in the last 2 days. That skill now, in a sense, is used as a way of taking us away from racialized language, but in the sense sometimes skills still contains sort of notions of race and gender. So that's so still agreeing with the pessimistic side. So I guess where I do see some sort of I don't know about hope, but I do believe that the lived world cannot be fully categorized, and there's always possibilities for categorical escape or leakages of categories. So that then means that people can also maneuver to switch categories through different kinds of strategies. And very hard to think of a Singapore example, but because to me, it partly depends on what, again, we discussed, implementation efficiencies. So there's these categories, but it's also partly dependent on how efficient the state is in implementing the categories. So in that zone of permissiveness that sort of exists between the formal categories and real life, there is always space for some kind of categorical escape. So and we do see this in sort of in like irregular migration. I mean, which are in the shadowlands and not really captured by the categories of the state. And the last point I want to make is that there are also other centers of power apart from the state that could also compete with the state in categorizing people. So these could be sources of licitness as opposed to legality. So so it is, to me, a more complex picture than a completely hopeless one.
So on the theme of sliding away from pessimism a little bit, I'll add amazement. And I hope you will share my amazement when I narrate a particular example. So I talked about the F1 classification, which is for students. So the F1 says you're an international student. Your primary job is to be a full-time student at the university with which your visa is attached. You cannot study at another campus. And there is some provision for on-campus work. But primarily, the identity that is drilled onto the international student is that you are an international student. Your status is subordinated to the university or college, and they are responsible for making sure that you maintain your status. Great. You understand that. Now, anybody here that works on World Trade Organization, the 4 modes of trade? Okay, so the world of trade agreements and negotiators have classified the buzzing world of trade in 4 types. I won't go over all of them. One of them is when foreigners come to your economy and they purchase goods and services. Tourism is a great example. So that's one of the 4 modes. For the US economy, international fee-paying students are actually people to whom you have sold or exported a service, right? So the same student who is told you are subordinate to the college or university, this is your place and be disciplined and stay in it, are also foreign consumers who have given business as a trade partner to the United States, right? So they're the export market. And when you put them, so I tell my students this, that do you realize that you are an export market? You have purchasing power here. You have to grow that. No, you have some entitlement here. It's not that you have to kind of shrink yourself. And so when you think about how the same position occupies different sorts of registers in the political economy of world's capital and capitalist relations, it raises new questions for us, I would say.
Thank you for the 2 more optimistic answers to balance out the other ones. Now we'll open up for questions, and I believe that there is a device that will be moved around.
Am I the first? Oh. Thank you for a very thought-provoking evening. And it's amazing that in under an hour, we've looked at migration from so many different perspectives, from the historical, the sociological, geographical, area studies, economic, etc. Can I ask Professor Fernandez to add one more? I'm an early stage gender studies researcher, and I know gender studies scholars, early scholars who said that there is no domain of human activity, there is no aspect of human life which cannot benefit by our revisiting it with a gender lens on. So when you look at migration, the phenomenon of migration from a gender studies perspective, which I know is one of your big strengths, are there new things that unfold themselves? Are there new perspectives that develop?
So when I look at migration and when I look at my work focuses on migrant domestic workers, and actually I feel like I'm a bit of a fraud on this panel because I look at Ethiopian migrant domestic workers in the Middle East. So my work is not really on Asian migration. But that said, I look at it. I look at migration through the lens of social reproduction, from a feminist perspective on social reproduction, which, from that perspective, we're looking at how do people produce life, both within their context, but also when they cross contexts. Yeah, the trans-border reconfigurations of those arrangements of care, the sort of care in terms of your daily reproduction, but also biological reproduction across borders, and generational reproduction. So from the feminist perspective, you're thinking along these lines of the sort of protection and production of life itself. And that this is gendered, in important ways. Now that those relationships are always variable depending on a particular which context you're talking about, but they're always important. And that process of migration will also result in a reconfiguration of the gender relationships as well. Very broadly put. But I think, we could ask Brenda as well to share, because she's done a lot of work on gender and thinking this through probably for a lot more time than I have.
I'll just add that I think to look at social reproduction transnationally is very important in migration research. Sometimes in migration studies, we tend to be very focused on what's happening in the receiving country without taking into account what's happening in the so-called source countries, sending countries. So take the case again of migrant domestic workers. They basically work for two families, right? They work for the social reproduction of their employer's family, but also they provide not just monetary remittances, but also transnational care chains that, in a sense, support their so-called left behind families. So I think it's important, and particularly when you give focus to Asia, because Asia has both sending and receiving, it takes us away from this very receiving country kind of focus that sometimes misses out the transnational care chains and the whole dynamics between sending and receiving. And of course, it's more complicated than that, we know, because of multinational migration these days. So it's a whole chain of serial migration that connects sort of a global hierarchy of countries into the very important question of social reproduction. Yeah.
Thank you for raising that question. I think it's important for us also to bring in that into the conversation.
Can I add one more thing quickly on the gender point? So, if you look at the ways in which the success of the tech sector in India is talked about, it is very gendered. It's about national pride, success, intellectual prowess, skills in engineering, all of that, it's very masculine aligned. It's a success story that rests on, even though in the ground it's all genders, but the quality of the story is one of masculine success because it's STEM, engineering, so on and so forth. But then the people employed in the US are placed in a dependent, highly racialized position because of their visa. So the larger discourse about success, national pride, and the masculinization of that representation doesn't carry quite as much in the migrant context in the United States. But that doesn't mean that people still don't feel as though they are part of the larger success nationalist story of that is masculinity aligned. So I think this is something to remember, that the ways in which these imaginations take place in one place, given the post-colonial context of a country trying to develop itself, and what then happens to its people when they are transformed into the migrant labor position. And I'm talking about the tech folks. If you include across the employment and skill sector, the story gets even more complicated from the gender lens.
Thank you. In the interest of time, perhaps we can just take 2 questions and then present them to our panelists, and they can take them as they see fit.
Hi. So a quick question. So my question is, the nationality of a person still plays a major role, even though we have gone through major changes like skill changes and different categorization, but still the majority of it, the first step is a nationality. Do you see the nationality part moving towards a different based on skills or something else? So this is my question.
And perhaps we can take one more.
I just wanted to add something towards the social aspect of what is happening in the source country. I'm coming from Kerala. It's a southern part of India, and it has one of the largest migrant populations in India. So what happens is Kerala has a very strong, literate and well qualified migrant workforce who travel to different countries. So what happens there is that, especially in a country like India, where it is much more of familial bonds that are much more, and the children and the parents are dependent on the children when they get old. So the problem that we face there, I just wanted to add something to what you've told. What we face there in Kerala, and the government is also working on the particular point, what happens is that the old age population is still there in Kerala and their children are not there. So we are having a crisis in terms of taking care of this old age population, which we are still figuring out. So I just wanted to put that point forward.
Thank you. Is there a question? Perhaps we can move on to this question in the front.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't know what, I was just intrigued whether you have talked during your workshop about, Brenda, you mentioned the migrant as a subject, and I wondered whether you have also talked about the desubjectivation of migrants in the context of, I'm from Europe, and we do engage a lot since latest 2015 with decentering migration and border studies, in the way that we also talk less about the production of migration, but the production of borders. And now in the case of Singapore, Brenda, there's in particular this case of when you talked about non-integration, I was instantly talking about the clearance that is made by providing visa by category, which is a massive labeling, right, of migrant workers or of any kind of person who comes to Singapore to work there. So I wondered whether you engaged in your workshop and also in the categories about the desubjectivation of migrants and also about the production of borders.
Okay, before I forget, I think the question about nationality and whether that's completely gone away, I mean, it certainly hasn't. So, of course, I mean, the language of skills is now very much part of the way that some people admitted and not others. So there's a global race for talent, for example, at the highly skilled level. And also many countries are hungry for low-skilled, cheap labor. So has nationality and race basically gone away because we use skills calculus? Certainly not. I mean, I think skills basically is a mask for race. So to give you an example, I mean, in Singapore, we have domestic workers from 3 source countries, basically Indonesia, Philippines, and Myanmar. So, of course, they're all admitted into the most unskilled category, the work permit category. But if we look closely, there is a hierarchy in terms of nationality because they are paid completely different wages. So the Filipinos, partly because of the Filipino state's effort to fight for their rights, have a minimum wage they can pay. The Indonesians will be next, but of course the Burmese workers are paid even lower than the other 2 nationalities. So just to illustrate that it hasn't gone away. The elderly left behind, I think that is such an important research topic because care is being, in a sense, there's a care deficit, right, in the advanced countries. And you bring in all these care workers, domestic workers to fill that care vacuum and to for elder care, childcare, and so forth. But of course, that leaves a huge vacuum in descending countries where whether it's elderly or children basically are then, in the sense, in a situation where they will have to find different kinds of care. So I do quite a bit of work on that. So we have looked at care chains as well as webs of care, very precarious webs of care for children and for the elderly in the source countries. Yeah. So and then the question of subjectivities, I mean, such a big question, but not sure whether you want to answer this first. I guess I think the main point of the discussion is that by categories basically form the subjects. So because you're supposed to fit into a particular category, then that fashions a subject according to the demands of the category. So many of us also have to perform to these categories, right? If you want to migrate into a particular category, then you have to, in a sense, shape yourself to fit that particular category, even though, I mean, this is actually not what you're most comfortable with. I'm sure there's more to this. So, okay.
Just to pick up on the point about borders, I think, using the words of Etienne Balibar, that borders are polysemic, right? So there are multiple registers in which we could be thinking about borders, and where does the border end? Where does it begin? Is always the question, right? And who's defining it? All of these are, and like, if you're talking about the Gulf context, and when you're talking about surveillance, the border is, isn't at the airport. The border is present, in the everyday negotiations and in, the need to produce your ikama wherever, have it with you. And then if you're talking about Europe and the externalization of the border, you've got the Frontex policies, where the border is extended to North Africa and, other parts of the Mediterranean. So I think they are entangled, how we're thinking about borders and who's crossing, the permeability of the border as well. Who is it permeable to? Yeah. So it isn't a sort of a given what the border means, in as much as even what a migrant means is not. We tend to assume that category as a given. Even when we talk about migrant domestic workers, we're reducing them in a sense to that aspect of their identity. But there are a whole lot of other things. They might be artists, they might be grandmothers, they might be whatever, a whole a range of other parts of their identity that are salient to them. yeah, that are not defined by the work that they happen to be doing. Yeah, I'm more than an academic. You know why? But I chose in this forum to say it's my identity as a settler in Australia that matters. A migrant settler, and I want to say that foreground that. But we don't always foreground. I think almost every single one of us in this room is a migrant, but that's true even when I teach. When I'm talking to my students, we're all migration is part of the human existence, the human experience. We're all migrants in different ways, even if we have migrated from the next town, right? So we need to remember that. And not think of migrant as that other person.
So I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut off this discussion because a reception awaits. So first of all, extending thanks to our distinguished panelists and, of course, all of the participants over the course of these 2 years, and to the leadership at CIRS, who has put together this phenomenal program. Thank you.